Very well. We're very happy now to finally begin this extraordinary course, which, by the Lord's grace, we're able to begin. This course will be focusing mainly on the great figure of Pavel Florenskij. Pavel Florenskij is certainly one of the great figures who can undoubtedly help us navigate through this current century. It would be hard, given a presentation like this one that's intended to be short, to showcase the enormity of such a figure. Yet it's a fact that Pavel Florenskij is one of the great titans of the faith. Actually, we're going to be treating him as a teacher, as a guide as well, and also as a spiritual father who can help us understand the signs of the times, who can help us regain the authenticity of Christian life. And finally, in this sense, we have someone who can help us get into communion with the Holy Trinity. And therefore, it's possible now for us to glorify His name. So, for this first time, what we have to do now is to carry out a little presentation. And this presentation is going to be based basically on this text by Francisco José López Saez, a Spanish priest, titled Beauty, Memory of the Resurrection, Theodicy and Anthropodicy in Pavel Florenskij. And it's also worth mentioning that this text was published by Editorial Monte Carmelo. Now, as the basis for this presentation, we're going to be following precisely the general guidelines that Cardinal Thomas Spidgick presents, and he's actually the one who makes the presentation for this text. So, basically, what we're going to be doing today is to give a general idea of the purpose of this course that we begin today on the one hand, and also to understand the great spiritual richness, the great Christian richness and philosophical richness, and the great cultural richness in general that the great Father Pavel Florenskij will give us. So, I give you the invitation to follow step by step this itinerary, which is really a great spiritual adventure, perhaps a little bit hard or complicated at times, but there's a crucial fact. It will always bear good fruit, and especially it will help us get into communion, deep communion with the truth. So, let us hold our hands spiritually and truthfully with Pavel Florenskij, so that he can help us understand what's really going on currently, and what the fundamental Christian demand is, the one that the King of Kings is asking of us, which he is advocating in all souls. So, the first thing we're going to do is, at the beginning of the presentation, which corresponds to page 9 of this book, and it says, information and communication media have amplified, now in our times, in amazing ways our cultural horizon. So it's this media, the one that we're actually using right now, right? Like the making of these videos and the like. However, this naturally cannot simply avoid having consequences for the Christian life. So, we have to acknowledge and consider, on the one hand, that these information and communication media, the media in general, cannot really avoid having consequences and repercussions in the Christian life itself. Why? Because Christ wants all the cultures in the world to be His own. So, the first thing we notice is that Christ wants all the cultures in the world to be His own. And this is precisely the main element, the one that we're going to be using as a basis for this course. The fact that it is Christ Himself who wants all the cultures in this world to be His own. And precisely for this kind of project, for a project like this, is that we adhere to these contemporary technologies that allow us to increase the information, and thus we can also get into this flow of communication that pretty much reigns today. Perhaps the first thing that we should ask ourselves is, in what sense does Christ want to make all the cultures of this world His? What would, let's say, the primordial sense be through which Christ actually wants to fulfill this purpose? And what we see is that in order to make this project of fulfillment possible, carried out by Christ, to actually have all the cultures in this world as His own, we need to understand that if we take the cultures of this world, if we consider them in a superficial way, we're going to be faced with irresolvable conflicts. For instance, problematic situations in which, let's say, one culture does not seem to fit with another one. As a general example, a very general one, it's as though, let's say, we were trying to make an immediate comparison between East and West. It would seem as though, in short, that we would be facing two completely different worlds. So, in order to complete this project of fulfillment, the fact that Christ himself wants to make all the cultures of this world his own, we need to understand the way. So in this sense, the world. Right? So in this sense, we need to understand also and to consider the fundamental aspect of cultures. And for this purpose, what we need to realize and really understand is that cultures complement each other when they're being compared to one another. What does this mean? That the first step for Christ to make his all cultures is to mutually compare these same cultures. It's not about confronting them. It's not about making them clash into each other conflictively, so to establish emphatical judgments like, this is right, this is not right. No, it's about contemplating them in their integrity and to mutually compare them. This in such a way that we are capable of understanding the reciprocal enrichment that actually all cultures, all of them, are ultimately called to contribute with. Or, in other words, to put it differently, we need to comprehend the cultural process of collaboration. So, in the cultures, meaning all cultures, all of them, what has to be understood is that it's a process of collaboration, and therefore of enrichment. As we make this contrasted comparison, when mutually contrasting these cultures, comparing them, we will then be able to realize what is it that each and every culture is summoned to contribute with for this ensemble that we will be calling in simple terms the world. So, to put it succinctly, we need to really be humble enough to understand that a distinct culture, as different as it may be, has something to tell us, and thus something to give us. In a very summarized way, we would say, we need to work on the spirit of Catholicity. Why is this? Because Catholicity is not allergic to any of the fundamental universalisms of the enrichment. Actually, what's most harmful to our current task of comprehension, cultural comprehension, are really sterile reductionisms. In other words, to be entrenched in a very close environment which is incapable of accepting something that, first, it doesn't know, and second, it doesn't comprehend. So, what we really need to do is to embrace a true Catholic spirit, and this is the collaboration and the enrichment. The Catholic spirit. So, in this sense, we can say that Pavel Florenskij is the great titan of the Catholic spirit. He is, in a manner of speaking, this great luminous spirit of fundamental reconciliations that don't avoid painful contradictions or unsolvable antinomies, but instead, simply put, it's going to lead us gradually into a higher level of comprehension. And this is the Catholic spirit, a higher level of comprehension. And this higher grade of comprehension is at the same time based on a kind of dual dynamic, right? First, to be generous. What does this mean? It means that we have to be generous and offer other cultures the very best that we have been able to achieve so far. And second, to be receptive. To accept that our own particular cultural achievements are not the only thing that we can hope for, but rather that we need also to let ourselves be fertilized, so to say, by alternative possibilities, which doesn't mean that simply because we find them incomprehensible at certain times, they are somehow sterile. So we need to make an effort to try to reach, finally, this higher level of comprehension. And this higher level of comprehension depends first on the one hand on contribution, and therefore it depends on generosity, to give and to share the best cultural achievements that up to this point we have been able to precisely obtain. Why? Because these achievements that we have been able to obtain so far are for the benefit of all humankind. Or in other words, culture is not the exclusive privilege of a very small group. Culture is, so to say, the most precise and clear manifestation of the most human aspect of humanity. And therefore, culture is an activity of mutual enrichment that, again, does not exclude any sort of miscomprehension or complication, but that doesn't rule out either a possibility of a higher comprehension, nor to actually get into a real and true communion with one another. Especially considering nowadays that we're living in sort of a very multicultural kind of age. Now, where cultural diversity, more than different cultures in themselves, seems to make an appearance in a very chaotic way, in such a globalized world as this one where we're living in today. So, here we can distinguish one of the main objectives that we are setting out now to achieve throughout this course, this long course also. That we actually get to have a good understanding of this heavily complicated and cultural and globalized world that we're living in today. And to understand the true Catholic stance that we should take when dealing with this contemporary world. And for this, Father Pavel Florenskij is an extraordinary teacher. And this is what, little by little, he is going to be teaching us. On the other hand, also, this higher grade of comprehension is not just about this one level of contribution, but also about reception. And therefore, of fertility. We also have to learn to be open to these other manifestations that do have something to tell us. In other words, we have to exercise a true dialogic spirit. Because true dialogue is about first listening to something I'm getting, and then to try to assimilate the fundamental contribution or the substantial contribution that this offers me. And thus, we're always called to be taking a stance of true generosity and fertility, of contribution and reception. When this kind of dynamic really happens, we're then entitled to talk about authentic collaboration and authentic enrichment. And in this light, we can now see there's generosity and fertility, or also spiritual greatness and spiritual humility are absolutely necessary to understand this task that Christ wants to carry out, which, as we've said, is to have all the cultures in the world as his own, and to defeat various temptations. First one being, to suppose that we, as a given particular culture, have the last word. The second one, to simply take for granted that others have really nothing to offer. And third, to suppose that that which others have to offer is irrelevant or somehow inferior. In this way, hence, and let me repeat this, what we need is generosity and spiritual greatness and spiritual humility, so that we can then get into the fundamental Christian dynamic of these times. In this dynamic, as I said, this great titan of the faith, this luminous witness that helps us get through this 21st century, the one we are part of, will allow us to carry it out in an extraordinary way, in an impeccable way. So, we will be focusing first precisely on highlighting the inexhaustible fertility of the authentic Catholic spirit, which leads us to, as Hans Urs von Balthasar would say, tear down the strongholds, or to tear down the pre-established borders, to be able to grasp a source of alternative enrichment that most definitely has a lot to teach us. and also to exercise and work on our spiritual greatness, to share with all humankind, with all our true and authentic community, that which the Lord has allowed us to obtain for the benefit of everyone. So then, we can say, all the cultures that Christ wants to make his in the Catholic spirit really means, therefore, what Christ wants to do, what Christ is really interested in establishing, which is an authentic community. But this community, however, is not just simply a community. It's not a usual community. It's not the kind of community that's accessible to us, not the kind that is feasible in human terms. This is a community that's alive and fruitful. This is a community, the kind of community that's capable of going through each and every one of the limitations that are sometimes humanly impossible to avoid. To put it briefly, and this is, in my opinion, the true heart that beats in the work of the great Pavel Florenskij. How is it that Christ wants to make his all the cultures in the world? Understanding, of course, this dynamic that we just explained in a very summarized way, it's done by establishing an authentic community in the authentic Catholic spirit. And what is this community? It's holiness. Because holiness surpasses any kind of human limitation. Of any kind, such as language, context, customs, thoughts, nationalisms, patriotisms, and overall interests. What does this mean? That, to my understanding, the most essential contribution that Pavel Florenskij can offer us today is to grasp the true depth of establishing an authentic Catholic community. And this Catholic community is none other than holiness. So now we can understand that if Christ wants to make all the cultures of this world his own, this really means that he wants to make them his own through holiness. And therefore, by means of a new way of being that actually bursts in this world of ours. And this is precisely the scheme that Florensky describes throughout the entirety of his work. Taking all this into account, we can now clearly see what true ecumenism really consists of. By the by, ecumenism is not really a reunion or gathering of different confessions. Or to put it in other words, ecumenism is not really an argument or discussion of different positions. Authentic ecumenism is nothing more than communion in the same spirit. And in this sense, this communion in the same spirit is nothing more than holiness. So, if we really want to participate or collaborate with Christ in this extraordinary project, what we need to learn is how to be holy in these times, surpassing, let's say, the specific demands of a particular historical context. And this is precisely what the great titan Pavel Florenskij, this untamed giant who is at the same time a small child, what this living antinomy will teach us. And he will do it, so to say, by encompassing an integral worldview of all things. And this means that Florensky, in this sense and in this worldview, will have a deep understanding that this project of holiness has an impact on and involves all dimensions of what's real. This means that this is not limited to just one particular aspect, but that this has a direct impact on all aspects of reality. This big community project, then, has an impact and compromises the entire creation. In order to be able to realize this precisely, we will be doing it based on the Russian perspective. And this is because this Batyushka, or spiritual father, Pavel Florenskij, was actually a Russian man. Now, this is the first step that we're going to take in this dynamic of collaboration and enrichment. We are going to get closer to Russia. We're going to let ourselves be fertilized by Russia, right? And by this, we're going to receive and try to assimilate and make fruitful everything that we're going to be getting through Pavel Florenskij for the benefit of the whole world, of this great community. So, what is it that's going on in Russia? The thing is that Russian culture is unfortunately not very well known, and therefore we can say that it's not really seized upon. Just until recently, this voice that comes to us all the way from this other side of the world is just finally being recovered from Russia. And it's an invigorating voice. This is a voice that will let us purify, and it will also let us grow in really unfathomable and extraordinary ways. So here, we also have to highlight this great merit, as Cardinal Spieldeck mentions, of Francisco José López Saez, the author of this text. And what is it? What is this merit that we're attributing to Father Francisco José López Saez? Not only that this is the first fundamental contribution, at least coming from the most western part of Europe, and thus the world, from one of the most luminous children that the East has. In other words, this text by Francisco José López Saez, the Spanish priest born in Alcázar de San Juan, Ciudad Real, in 1964, a priest from the Diocese of Ciudad Real, professor of dogmatic theology and ecumenism in the theological center of the diocesan seminary. It's not only, so to say, the first great introduction, systematically elaborated, of this great Russian thinker. Before him, there had been no other works of this size and scale, or of this extraordinary quality. But also, he had the great merit, López Saez, of having been able to get into Florenskij's world, and he was able to receive him with all the cultural references and the thinking parameters, the symbolic and poetic imagery, and especially of having grasped, in this sense, the fundamental core of Pavel Florenskij, precisely his sanctity, a sanctity that's a true example for every authentic Christian, for every truly integral Catholic. And thus, if we move now and take a look at page 10, Cardinal Spieldeck says at the beginning of the second paragraph, in our current civilization, looking to organize the world through ideologies and technical projects, which is precisely what we see today, don't we? What we commonly refer to in simple terms as scientific progress. What we have is that Russian thinking instead gives chief importance to anthropology. So, what does this mean? That the Russians actually have a very special sensitivity to address the human question. It would certainly be very lengthy to give individual reference to each and every one of these Russian authors, but perhaps it's sufficient to just mention some of the most unknown figures, like Nikolai Gogol, and to read some of his texts, which are extraordinary, and by the way, he's one of my favorite authors. To be able to understand precisely this Russian sensitivity for the reality of the person, really beyond this technological and technical and even ideological environment where he interacts. Or to read as well the work of the great Mikhail Bulgakov, and to grasp the way in which the Russians haven't been dazzled by the great technological luminosity as opposed to the way people in the West have experienced it, and they have been preoccupied instead with the question of human reality, in the environment where they find themselves living. Without mentioning all of the great Russian authors that would deserve a very special tribute, who, while being prisoners and captives under the Soviet regime, and particularly being prisoners in the Gulag, which is the same thing that actually happened to Father Pavel Florenskij, they were nevertheless capable of overcoming these terrible, horrible historical conditions by means of not losing hope in human greatness. And here we would find, for instance, someone like Boris Pilniak or Eugene Samyatin, and, of course, many others that I unfortunately cannot recall immediately right now. And so, Cardinal Spielnik also says in this presentation, while most part of our contemporaries are concentrating their efforts on describing the fundamental features of nature and also focusing on fundamental human rights, thus on abstract legal principles, the Russians have discovered the prerogatives of the unrepeatable human nature, embodied in a unique and proper way, and nonetheless essentially agape-like, capable of loving even self-sacrifice. So we can say then that this is the fundamental motor that moves this whole project of holiness, the capacity of loving even self-sacrifice. Now, we can see more clearly how is it that this fundamentally Christian project does not depend on what we would visually expect from holiness. For example, miracle working, right? Or the manifestation or production of supernatural events that would leave anyone puzzled. It's not about that. It's more about performing a real ontological revolution. A profound change within ourselves that, as we will see, necessarily entails the gradual annulment of aseity, of this self, this ego, that's confined within itself, and therefore unwilling to receive this light that can set him free. So hence, holiness, here considering this first point, consists of, firstly, as we have seen, on the capacity of loving even self-sacrifice. And, as we will see throughout these sessions, particularly when we talk about the hero, this is not really about a merely heroic situation, right? As to sacrifice oneself in a merely superficial way, as by men in general. No, this is really about an ontologically agape-like reality, agape-like and kenosis-like, to love and to die so we can love. So this is really the central and main dynamic of which Pavel Florenskij, or about which Pavel Florenskij, as an extraordinary Russian, takes back for his motor. Now, to be able to carry out this task of love to the point of self-sacrifice, which is to say this holiness, which is exactly what Christ wants to do, precisely as a project of incorporating all of the cultures in the world, and have them as his own, in his own reality, which is his own divine reality. We see now that Pavel Florenskij considers this capacity of love, capacity of loving even self-sacrifice, has as a foundation and purpose the very Holy Trinity. In such a way that we're now beginning to visualize how is it that the great father Pavel Florenskij will not find limits in the conditions or in the description of the anthropological conditions of man to carry out this gesture. No, he will understand that the root from which this capacity of loving even self-sacrifice sprouts is the Holy Trinity. Here is the spine and the foundation of this condition. Here we have, let's say, the actual support. And why is this? Well, it's because we can see that Father Pavel Florenskij is developing a very rich theological and spiritual meditation on the Holy Trinity. Thus, finally, this fact about Christ wanting to make his all of the cultures in the world means that we have to get deeply into the very heart of the Holy Trinity. And therefore, it is through the Holy Trinity that we can participate in this original community, precisely given by the Father, by the Son, and by the Holy Spirit, And by our entry, we're given this very great gift of this overwhelming participation in holiness, which is capable of surpassing any kind of human limitation. But in order to be able to take this step, it is necessary for us to understand the demands that this entails. Why? Because it's a hard road. To die to oneself is by no means an easy path. But we can be sure about one thing. It's the only thing worth in this life. Really, it's the only thing worth. For example, Kant, this German philosopher, with whom Florensky is going to eventually settle things straight, couldn't understand, for example, the meaning that a concept such as the Holy Trinity could possibly have in practical life. Let's just put it like this. Kant was never able to understand the way or ways in which the study and comprehension of a concept like this one can impact our daily lives, in our practical lives, in our moral lives, in our ultimately factual lives. Factual is based on the facts that we see in our everyday lives. But Florensky will show us, and in a very convincing way, how this first article of faith actually illuminates the totality of the Christian life. And this totality of Christian life means then that the Holy Trinity is the spine and the real foundation of all life, both personal and social, and how this gives a real value to the cosmic nations involved with the faith, even integrating all sorts of scientific meditations. So, what Florensky is actually going to show us, in short, that the Holy Trinity is the very essence that configures the totality of Christian life, thus both personal and social. So, we see that the totality of Christian life rests on the Holy Trinity. That's why, according to Florensky, the most fundamental thing is not really about engaging in projects that would seem acceptable or something of that sort, but that end up being irrelevant precisely because they are not located at the center of what's real. So Florensky says that the first fundamental thing is to focus deeply on the reality of the Trinity, so that from there we can extract the necessary light that's required to configure the totality of Christian life, both personally and socially. And for this purpose, the first point on which Florensky is going to concentrate, so that we can actually get a general idea of what his project is about, is the Slavic word for truth, with the whole notion of what the concept signifies. And the Slavic word is istina. Now, it's certainly interesting how Florensky, while considering that it is on the Holy Trinity that the whole of Christian life rests, both personally and socially, this happens in the very source of truth itself. Here we can see, even during a very brief presentation like this one, that we can understand that if Christ wants to make his all the cultures in the world, he wants to make these cultures of the world his through communion with truth. Because what to commune with truth really means is to get into communion with the Holy Trinity, and therefore to go across the path of holiness itself. Now, it is precisely here that we can see the truly Christological aspect of Saint Father Pavel Florenskij's project, which allows us to get into communion directly with the Holy Trinity. This project of fulfillment, which is actually being carried out already, where the totality of Christian life rests, which leads us to the Holy Trinity, means, first, to get deeply into the truth, engaging in a really profound and serious exercise, both intellectual, thus philosophical, and also interior, thus spiritual, so that we can ultimately retake the right path that will lead us to life. But that it's not just about biological life, but rather eternal life. That's why Florensky starts first philologically from the meaning of this Slavic word, istina, which means everything that breathes. In other words, Florensky, unlike Kant, will show us that truth is not something abstract, but rather truth is one living truth. And therefore, to get in contact with truth is the very same thing as to get in contact with this life that this truth is transmitting us. This means, thus, that truth, according to Florensky, is a living truth. We could put it like this: it's one trinitary truth. In short, the living truth is none other than the Holy Trinity. That's the living truth. And then, in this sense, Florensky will clearly show us that therefore knowledge of the truth cannot by any means be separated from life, and hence from this unity that we're summoned for, to actively participate in this living truth. So we now see that this is not about a simple kind of knowledge, not the way in which we usually understand this word, to acquire some information that we regard to some extent as comprehensible. For instance, 2 + 2 = 4. Florensky will show us that this is not the only knowledge that we are called to have access to, but that we're also called to have access to an intimate knowledge of the living truth. And what this is going to do ultimately is to completely transform us. So an intimate, profound, and integral knowledge of this living truth is precisely a necessary condition to have access to holiness, and therefore to community, and therefore to the Catholic spirit, to this dynamic of collaboration and enrichment through which Christ wants to make his all the cultures in the world. And it is here that we can see what the actual scope of Pavel Florenskij's project really amounts to. What Pavel Florenskij is looking for then, in this sense, to take on a total transfiguration of the world. In other words, if Christ wants to make his all the cultures of the world, this means that Christ actually wants to transfigure culture. Right here, we can actually see that what Christ wants to do is to transfigure culture. All the cultures of the world. And to transfigure culture means that culture then will be transfigured into cult. So it retakes its fundamental root, because it's precisely from the word cult that the word culture was derived. It's nothing more really than the project that Christ himself had already told us about in the Gospels. The Father wants now worshippers in spirit and in truth. Here we can see now, in simple terms, the fundamental service that the Lord is being offered by Florensky to everyone's Lord, to the Lord of the living and the dead, this obscure man of Galilee, as Balthasar refers to him. Here we can see that the aim is to transfigure culture, and therefore, this means for culture to recover its primordial roots, as in cult. And this cult is not the one appealing only to external forms. For example, as in the way liturgy must be celebrated, the way we should be dressed, or what we should or should not eat, or regarding our moral behavior. No. The transfiguration of culture in cult is precisely holiness. in such a way that we can now notice here as well one of the main implications that are derived from this perspective. We need to really understand that in this 21st century, there's only one way to really change the world, and it is to be saints. Everything else is not really a change in the world. It's just accommodating in the world. It's the kind of accommodation in the structure of the systematic power that reigns today. In this network, immense network of lies and hypocrisies, and therefore of fear and deceit that the whole world is actually subject to, including all of the souls that are really part of this world. Hence, this means that to take this project seriously is to seriously take into account the great spiritual adventure that the Holy Trinity has prepared for us, holiness, and thus to have access to the incomprehensible joy of the cult that the Lord is precisely manifesting to all of us. A kind of cult that, even though it's certainly hard and very painful and replete with suffering, we also have to acknowledge that it has an abundant peace that the world doesn't know, and a joy that's none other than the worldly initiation of heaven. So now, we can then avoid falling into a merely sorrowful perspective, not of just suffering, but not about evasion either, as to get immediately to the resurrection. No, we have to take it step by step. We have to go through the Via Crucis to finally be able to get to the resurrection. So, in this sense, what is the meaning of cult? To preach the truth. Cult as a preaching of the truth. But not any truth. Not this truth that we very often simply take as the logically structured elaboration of a discourse, or having the logical indulgence of what we find acceptable. No, preaching the truth means, in this sense, the profound communion with the living truth in such a way that this cult, as a preaching of the truth in the world, means first to be light, both in what we say and in what we live. This preaching of the truth demands then the transfiguration of the person, and therefore that this preaching of the truth be latent and exactly the fundamental motor for the human being, both in what's visible and what's invisible, thus both in his external witness and his internal witness, and also with regards to what men perceive, and especially with regards to what only God knows, the heart's most intimate, in such a way that we're not just an outward project. We don't want to show ourselves to the world as apparent preachers of truth. We actually want to be such preachers. That's why I told you that this was a whole road, a whole project, a whole ontological travel. Is everything clear so far? Good. So, this is why, for example, Descartes wanted to prove the existence of the self through thought. The very famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But Florensky instead said that we exist only if we are fully within the life of Christ. What does this mean? That to Florensky, someone who's not really inside, who's not really incorporated, in corpore, the body, in real flesh, in his full personal integrity, anybody outside of the living truth does not exist, does not live, but rather dies, and dies an atrocious death. This is the first deceit. So, we must now acknowledge how, even on a very fundamental common sense, not all life is life. Not any kind of life in this world is life. Sometimes we even acknowledge this even in the most common situations. For instance, when someone says something like, "This is not life," or "It's not life to live like this." And it's not only about appealing to material or social and economical realities, or activities of the sort in which we often participate, but it's more about understanding the deeply spiritual dimension of human beings. Because ultimately, to live in deception is not life. It's actually the annulment of life. So, what we see is that, indeed, what the Lord wants is to free us from this network of lies and hypocrisies that suffocate the soul and the spirit, burying it deep down here on earth, causing a real hellish torment. So, it is here that we can see as well a feature of profound consolation that Christ's project is actually in charge of transmitting us, precisely through Pavel Florenskij, to comfort souls in this slavery they're living in, and to have them participate in the infinite love and mercy that the Father has for each and every one of us. This is, we should say, the profoundly fatherly feature of this project by Pavel Florenskij. Now, in the West, for example, it's more analytic. Or to say, we are more conceptual. We are more logical. If by logic, what we understand is a theory that is conceptually coherent and well structured. In this sense, and I'm on page 11, about halfway through it, in this sense, one of the things that we can see is that, indeed, we in the West are certainly more seduced by discursive logic. Thus, we are easily seduced by the logical impact of argumentation. When we talk to someone and we're not convinced by something, we're really not convinced because of his lack of logic, or say, a thinking seduction. We say, "No, that's not logical," or "It doesn't seem to me that it's logical," or simply that it just doesn't convince me. This is actually something common in the West. And therefore, for instance, while we carry out this analytic and conceptual process of premises and conclusions, of a logical order of premises, if A then B, if B then C, if C then D, therefore, if A then D, we want to be following a logical sequence. When we try to apply this analytic tendency to Christ, what we do is, for example, 1. To divide Christ's own integrity. Why divide? Well, first, because we're trying, for example, to assume the meditations of the dying Christ on the cross that are actually the object of the risen Christ. And so we're locating both moments as one after the other, right? As in our own analysis of the life of Christ, each one represents a different event. So in this sense, our tendency is, one thing is the crucified, suffering, scourged Christ, the dead Christ, and another thing is precisely the risen, glorified, triumphant Christ. It is indeed because of this Western, analytically induced way of thinking that we can see now that today, for many sects, the Christ on the cross is gone. They tell you it's not a dead God. We, for example, have a God that lives. And what does it mean? That one of the problems that we have intellectually as Westerners is precisely division of total reality. To put it briefly, we actually have a really hard time to understand reality as one totality, as an ample totality. For us, it's certainly way easier, as logical and analytic Western people, to divide things, and to grasp it, for instance, through the fragments. Let us give 2 examples, Western of course, so we can see what we're talking about. First, biological investigations. Because it is harder to understand life in its integrity and thus its totality, we start to divide life in isolated aspects or elements or in isolated fragments until we reduce all of life's phenomena or biological phenomena to 21 pairs of chromosomes. And of course, these 21 pairs are obviously numbered because that way it's easier to manipulate them, right? So, we divide everything into fragments, and we analyze it, we slice it, and we're left with spare pieces. The other thing is aesthetical appreciation in the West. For example, before a painting, for this analysis, we resort to a kind of zoom effect. So I'm not really watching the painting in general. So I'm concentrating on the color, on the tone, or on a figure. So, for example, we talk about Van Gogh's Starry Night. And many will only focus on the sky, or maybe not even the sky, but the sun. The moon. The bright moon reflecting the light. And so we start to analyze, or again, to divide reality. What does this mean? That one of the difficulties that we face as Western people is our fragmented comprehension. Because indeed, this is our tendency, to grasp things in a fragmented way, in a divided way. Now, the Russians, on the contrary, regard Good Friday and Easter Sunday as inseparable in the mystery. So, what we see is that, for them, and this is something that we should recover as well, Christ appears as the great unifying agent of the ultimate contradiction, which is suffering and beatitude. And this is precisely the preaching of the truth. Hence, the preaching of the truth thus emerges here as the great unification, not really about putting together two divided aspects, but this is actually about the great unification that is manifested in the cult as the preaching of the truth. Hence, Christ is the great unification of the ultimate contradiction, suffering and beatitude, life and death. Which is what we, let's say as Westerners, have serious trouble when we're trying to address this. For instance, when talking about this analytic Western tradition, a good example that comes to mind would be Socrates, right? Because Socrates, for instance, in the Apology, when he's already sentenced to death, he gives an argument, although what I'm going to say is not textual, which says as follows: "It doesn't matter if I die, because when I die, I will not be alive. And while I live, I'm not dead." So, two things that are separated, divided, fragmented. Instead, for the Russian culture, and in general for this Eastern culture, things are not divided, but rather they can form an integral unity that we must make an effort to grasp through its complexity. So, cult, as a preaching of the truth, appears as the great unification. And this great unification, this preaching of the truth, is indeed incarnated, right? Or to say materialized and spiritualized, revealed in holiness. So, holiness is nothing more than this great antinomy of life, death, of suffering, and beatitude. In this great unification of life and death, of suffering and beatitude, this that we cannot easily understand, that we simply find incomprehensible, represents precisely the fundamental mystery that Christ institutes in the human soul. Only Christ is really capable of carrying out this unification that for us would be impossible and humanly inconceivable, between life and death, between suffering and beatitude. For this reason, what we now see is that actually The antinomy is the key to all of Pavel Florenskij's thought. And what is the antinomy? The antinomy is what's humanly irreconcilable. That's the antinomy. So, the mystery is indeed to Florensky, as in general for the whole Russian spirit. And if I make a mistake in something I'm writing, please tell me, okay? Sometimes I don't even know what I'm writing. What we see here is that, thus, the great mystery that we can experience in human life through the incorporation into the living truth is the antinomy. The antinomy that only Christ is able to support and to fertilize without surrendering to any of its integrating elements. In short, the antinomy is the humanly irreconcilable, and stressing the integration part of this, and at the same time, the full manifestation of divine omnipotence. Why? Because what is impossible for men to do, God Himself can do it. So the antinomy, in this sense, we can see how it moves, right? In this fundamental environment of both impossibility from a human perspective and of possibility from a divine perspective. So, the fundamental antinomy is Christ Himself, God and man. This is the fundamental antinomy through which everything else will, in this sense, be based on, or where it will eventually find all of its strength and vigor. So, we could see that the great antinomy, or mystery, that's the root for everything else, is the incarnation. That's why, to our friend, Pavel Florenskij, the incarnation plays a fundamental role, because we, as men, cannot understand why God became a man. And we don't understand either, how is it that a man can be God? Not false God claims or divinity claims, but to really be God Himself. That is, we could say, where we can find the first antinomy. So, the antinomy, and we're going to be using this word constantly, is what's humanly impossible to do, but that God does do. So we see that in the antinomy, two fundamental factors come into play. Human impotence of comprehending and the divine omnipotence of doing. And here's where we can also see that in this antinomy, when Father Pavel talks about the sacraments, when he talks about spirituality, about temptations and so forth, in all of it he finds the living presence of the antinomy, and therefore of the Holy Trinity. How is it that God is one and triune? We're not capable of understanding this antinomy. We clash, so to say, with something that's beyond our comprehension. And thus, according to Pavel Florenskij, moving a little bit forward, the antinomy can only be manifested in the symbol. Why? Because the symbol is that which is called to be bigger than itself. A symbol contains something, but not everything. A symbol shows us that which it contains, but at the same time, it invites us to move beyond it and not stay there. It invites us to go or to reach for something that's always bigger. And that's why, thus, and this is the first step that we're taking, perhaps the most complicated step, because it's the philosophical step, or the philosophical purification. This demands from the antinomy to bring forth a new reason, a new way of thinking, a new rationality, or to put it differently, a new intelligibility, because this new reason is none other than the authentic, believing reason. Thus, coherent with the cult that Christ establishes, and therefore reconciled with everything that oppresses it tears it, or threatens to annihilate it. So, in the first step, what Florensky will be trying to foster is a new reason. A new reason that, indeed, emerges as an authentic believing reason. And this is the first part that the book addresses, what is called the Theodicy. Then, once having been across the complicated itinerary, right? This way of appearing, of gestation and enlightenment, of the authentic believing reason. So in the text following Pavel Florenskij, he will take the second step, the antropodicy. Because antropodicy is not really just about having a new reason appearing, but actually about a new life. Or in other words, the first step is to address, in all its depth, the theoretical aspect of reality, the intellectual aspect of reality, and then move on to the practical aspect of life itself, right? What we, as Westerners, again, understand in a separate way as theory and practice, right? In this fragmented reason, right? Like divisive, right? Separating or separatist of reality itself. And so, what we see is that, to Florensky, this fundamental project, both about theodicy and about anthropodicy, rests on the following: the denial, in love, of the principle of identity. Thus, the denial, in love, of the very aseity. So, the sacrifice of the soliptic self, its own undermining, its own kenosis, that is the only thing which allows access to the truth. Thus, to die to oneself. This is the fundamental step. Only the denial, and I mean in love, because we, as Christians, we die to ourselves for something bigger, for Him. We do not die for something abstract. We die for someone. And this particular someone ultimately means everything to me. And therefore means everything to everyone. So, here is where Florensky is going to insist on this kenosis aspect. Here we have the first part, the cross. To crucify the self. To sacrifice oneself with all the limits and narrowness for something that's bigger. In such a way that thus the Christian, as a preacher of the truth in the world, is called to turn into a living symbol. Do you see why? Because now he's called to manifest in this world something that's bigger than himself. And this something that's bigger than himself can only be God. So, the fundamental behavior of holiness is to show something that's bigger than what's human. And therefore, to make God Himself present in the world. Here we can see that it's the capacity of loving even self-sacrifice. Because, as St. John the Baptist would say, the less and less I become, the greater God becomes. We're going to try to put it in a somewhat simple formula. What this is about is less me and more Him. Until it's no longer me, but Him. So, we see that holiness is also a path that starts from and goes to. Right? From the point that it is less and less me and more Him, until it's definitely no longer me, but fully Him. Alright? And this is ultimately what goes on in the dynamic of love. And for this, which is one of Florensky's most fundamental convictions, it is necessary to stop being just oneself and to get into full personal communion with the truth. This is the fundamental dynamic. And we will see, as I keep going a little bit forward, we will see that ultimately, to Pavel Florenskij, everything will be reduced to a disjunction. Either him or me. Here we will find the true conflict, human conflict, of man with regards to his communion with the truth. Either him or me. This way we see now, on page 12, at the beginning of the second line, how truth and knowledge, dogma and behavior are one and the same thing, and are distinguished only for the abstract intellect and for legalizing morality. Hence, for this Western position in which we're commonly trying to separate reality into fragments, right? To divide. Or so to say, for us, the more divided or fragmented something is, the easier it is for us to understand it. But there's also a hidden intention, more manageable, because it's there when we think that we have control, that I can actually control things. But instead, to try to capture the totality of reality means to lose control, to know that I cannot dominate it. So we could say, this is also about trying to overcome this will of domination that so much harms the world, including ourselves. This will of domination that consists of always wanting what we ourselves establish or what we ourselves decide, to be able to crush this rebellious will that will not accept anything bigger than the will itself, and therefore a blind will that restrains from something that's infinitely bigger. This too is another challenge for our culture. That's why we started trying to clear out the fundamental point of culture. In such a way that we thus see that we are called to know and recognize the truth. So, we're called to know the truth intellectually and to recognize the truth. To recognize the truth is to live it. It means to become true in such a way that it's not enough to just tell the truth. We have to assimilate it until the truth becomes the exclusive pattern of my life. And by the way, as we have been taught by the great Václav Havel, whom I recommend reading, the world is only defeated by living in the truth. To renounce, once and for all, a life in deception. It's the only way that we have to escape from this network of lies and of hypocrisies. Now, to become true, thus Christian, according to Florensky's proposed etymology, regarding the Russian word ishtina, as we said, truth, deriving the word from the Sanskrit roots, which express the action of breathing, it means then to become alive, truly alive, truly to be reborn into eternal life. And therefore, it does not mean that the preaching of the truth consists in the elaboration of grandiloquent speeches, right? An extraordinary discursive preaching, but that lacks invigorating substance. Really, to know and to recognize the truth means to turn into living beings. That is to say, to participate in the only living one, who is God in his trinitary existence. So, we could say, holiness within this mystery that we have seen, this antinomy, this community, yes, the community of the living, in truth. And why of the living in truth? Because they are already incorporated, similar to grafts, that are called to bear enormous fruit. So what the Lord is calling us to is to really take on the vocation that we have been precisely summoned to engage in. To manifest ourselves as authentic living beings in truth. So therefore, we, as men dying and reviving in resurrected Christ, we become one same thing with the Trinity, and we gain access to the gift of a new quality of life, and that Florensky will not hesitate at any moment to call this new quality of life memory of God. Thus, the eternal memory of God, the uncreated wisdom in which the model of the world is guarded just as it should be and just as it will ultimately be after his glorification. So, it's also here that we have this extraordinary giant, this unmanageable titan who is overwhelming and very rich in contributions, very rich in examples, very rich in this new wisdom, in this new quality of life, and very rich and overflowing in holiness. And so also one of his most extraordinary figures makes an appearance. Pavel Florenskij is the great guardian of the divine memory. Pavel Florenskij is exactly by accepting the mission that the Lord gave him, the great guardian of the living in truth, the great guardian of the cult that entails the preaching of the truth, the great guardian that teaches us how to transfigure culture, and ultimately, the great guardian of Christ's project to make all the cultures of the world his own. There we have this great guardian. I invite you to really pray to Pavel Florenskij, to ask for his intercession, his company, and to tell him, Saint Father Pavel Florenskij, adopt us as spiritual children of yours. You who are in heaven, help us not to disappoint Christ's project. Okay? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.